No one expected the old military dog to stop an entire hospital cafe with a single quiet decision. Hundreds of conversations faded into silence. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to waiting hands. A retired Navy SEAL stood frozen beside the entrance, staring at the one companion who had never ignored his voice in nearly a decade. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from today. It is always incredible to see this community come together from every corner of the world. If stories about loyalty, compassion, and second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing. And after you finish this story, we would truly love to know what touched your heart the most, because your thoughts inspire us to create even more meaningful journeys. Morning sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of St. Matthew Veterans Medical Center, washing the hospital cafe in warm shades of gold that softened even the busiest corners of the room. The rich aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the air, blending with the scent of warm cinnamon rolls and polished wood, while quiet conversations echoed beneath the gentle hum of espresso machines. Nurses hurried between shifts. Veterans laughed over breakfast. Families sat together before visiting loved ones upstairs. It looked like any ordinary weekday morning. Nathan Brooks stepped through the entrance carrying nothing more than a worn canvas backpack and the quiet posture of a man who had spent most of his adult life watching every room before entering it. At 39, the retired Navy SEAL still moved with calm confidence. His face carried the weathered look of years spent beneath unforgiving sun and ocean winds. His rugged olive jacket rested over a dark beige shirt, and beneath the open collar, the detailed tattoo of a German shepherd stretched along the right side of his neck, like a permanent reminder of the partner who had walked beside him through every mission that truly mattered. That partner padded quietly across the polished floor at his side. Valor, an 8-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat touched by silver around his muzzle, walked without pulling against the leash or glancing toward the crowded tables. His amber eyes calmly observed the room with the patience of a retired military working dog who no longer searched for danger but never forgot how. Nathan smiled faintly. "Looks crowded today, partner." Valor answered only with a slow sweep of his tail. They waited politely near the counter until Nathan noticed a single empty chair beside a woman sitting alone near the large windows overlooking the hospital gardens. She wore light blue nursing scrubs beneath a gray cardigan, and a wheelchair rested comfortably beside the table where she quietly read through patient notes while sipping coffee. Morning sunlight illuminated her gentle features, though a trace of quiet weariness rested behind her warm eyes. Nathan approached with the respectful hesitation of someone raised to value simple courtesy. "Excuse me," he asked with a friendly smile. "Would you mind if I sat here?" Before the woman could answer, everything changed. Valor suddenly stopped walking. The leash tightened softly. His ears lifted. His breathing slowed. Nathan felt the subtle shift immediately. Years of working together had taught him to recognize the smallest change in the German shepherd's body language. "Easy," he whispered. Valor did not respond. Instead of following Nathan toward the chair, the old K9 partner calmly stepped forward on his own. Every nearby conversation seemed to pause as the large German shepherd crossed the final few feet, separating him from the woman. A hospital volunteer instinctively looked up from her newspaper. Two security officers standing near the cafe entrance quietly exchanged uncertain glances. Nathan called softly, "Valor, heel." It was the same command the dog had obeyed through years of demanding assignments. For the first time in anyone's memory, Valor did not move. He reached the woman, gently lowered himself onto the floor beside her wheelchair, and rested his head against her hand as though greeting someone he had been searching for all his life. The woman looked down in complete surprise. Her fingers trembled slightly before they instinctively brushed across the thick fur between the dog's ears. Valor closed his eyes peacefully. The entire cafe fell silent. No one understood why the retired military dog had ignored the one voice he always trusted simply to sit beside a nurse he had supposedly never met. The silence inside the hospital cafe held for several long moments before anyone found the courage to move again. Coffee machines continued humming behind the counter. Trays clinked softly against polished surfaces, and somewhere beyond the dining area an elevator chimed as another floor welcomed new visitors. Yet every pair of eyes remained fixed on Valor. The retired military working dog rested peacefully beside the nurse's wheelchair, his broad head leaning gently against her hand, as though he had finally reached the place he had been searching for all morning. Nathan stood only a few feet away, holding the leash loosely in his hand. During years of serving together, he had trusted Valor in situations where hesitation could cost lives. Never once had the German Shepherd ignored a direct command. Not during training. Not during active deployments. Not even after retirement. This quiet moment unsettled him in a way old battlefield memories never had. "Valor," he called again, his voice calm but firm. "Come." The old dog slowly lifted his amber eyes toward Nathan. Recognition was there. Understanding was there. Yet instead of standing, Valor gently lowered his head once more beside the nurse's hand. Nathan let out a slow breath. The people watching from nearby tables began exchanging puzzled smiles instead of fearful glances. Whatever they had expected from the large German Shepherd, aggression clearly was not part of it. The nurse looked down at the dog with quiet disbelief. "I do not understand," she whispered. "Dogs usually like me, but none have ever done this." There was warmth in her voice, not fear. She slowly brushed her fingers across the silvered fur around Valor's ears. The German Shepherd closed his eyes for only a heartbeat before opening them again, completely at peace. Nathan approached carefully and offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry about this. His name is Valor. He has never behaved like this around someone he has never met." The nurse looked up at him with gentle blue eyes. "Maybe he thinks we have met." Nathan almost smiled at the unexpected answer. "That would be difficult." She nodded thoughtfully. "I know. I have never seen him before today." She extended her hand politely. "My name is Grace Mitchell." Nathan shook it gently. "Nathan Brooks." Before either of them could continue, an elderly physician walking through the café slowed as he noticed Valor. His weathered face brightened with recognition. "Well now," he said with a kind smile. "That is one handsome German Shepherd." He glanced toward Grace. "He seems to have chosen his favorite person rather quickly." Grace laughed softly, though uncertainty remained in her expression. "I wish I knew why." The physician knelt briefly beside Valor, allowing the old dog to sniff the back of his hand before standing again. "Dogs have remarkable memories," he said. "Sometimes better than ours." Those simple words lodged quietly in Nathan's thoughts. He looked more carefully at Grace for the first time. She appeared to be in her mid-30s. Her light blue nursing scrubs were neatly pressed beneath a gray cardigan, and her wheelchair showed the careful signs of daily use rather than recent injury. A small identification badge rested against her shoulder, its edges worn from years of service inside the hospital. Nothing about her seemed familiar, yet something about the way Valor watched her carried absolute certainty. Grace noticed Nathan studying the badge and smiled politely. "I have worked here for almost 10 years. Nathan nodded. "Then perhaps Valor has visited before." She gently shook her head. "This is actually the first time I have seen a retired military working dog in the café." Nathan glanced toward Valor once again. The old German Shepherd's attention had shifted slightly toward Grace's wheelchair. Not toward the chair itself, but toward a small metal emblem fastened just beneath the armrest. It was worn smooth by years of use, shaped like a tiny caduceus enclosed within a military crest. Nathan felt the faintest stir of recognition, distant and incomplete, like a memory trying to rise through morning fog. Valor quietly rested one paw beside the wheelchair, never taking his eyes from the emblem. And for the first time Nathan began to wonder whether the old dog had not recognized the woman herself, but something connected to a chapter of their lives that time had almost erased. The morning crowd gradually returned to its conversations, but the quiet corner near the window seemed untouched by the movement around it. Nurses collected breakfast trays before returning to their hospital floors. Veterans folded newspapers beneath half-finished cups of coffee. Families spoke softly about appointments waiting upstairs. Yet Nathan remained standing beside Grace's table, unable to ignore the strange certainty in Valor's behavior. The old German Shepherd had not shifted more than a few inches since resting beside the wheelchair. His breathing remained slow, his posture completely relaxed, but his attention never wandered from the small military medical emblem attached beneath the armrest. Nathan had seen thousands of patches, badges, and insignias throughout his years of service. Most faded into memory the moment a mission ended. This one refused to fade. Grace noticed his thoughtful expression and glanced toward the emblem herself. "This?" she asked gently. "It has been on my wheelchair since my rehabilitation." Nathan looked closer. The worn metal crest carried the symbol of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Time had softened its edges, but the design remained unmistakable. "Were you treated there?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Several years ago, after a car accident." Her voice remained calm, without self-pity. "I spent almost a year learning how to build a different kind of life." Nathan smiled with quiet respect. "And now you help other people every day." Grace looked around the busy cafe where several patients waved as they recognized her. "Some days they help me just as much." Valor slowly lifted his head as another nurse approached the table carrying a tray of fresh coffee. The younger woman smiled warmly. "Grace, your patients are already asking where you disappeared to." She looked down at the German shepherd with obvious admiration. "He is beautiful." Grace laughed softly. "Apparently we have become friends." The nurse reached out cautiously, allowing Valor to sniff the back of her hand before gently scratching beneath his chin. "He trusts you," she observed. Nathan quietly answered. "He usually takes a long time before trusting someone." The nurse looked surprised. "Then perhaps he remembers her." Those simple words settled into the silence between them. Nathan had heard similar comments twice already that morning. Normally, he would have dismissed them as kind observations from people who did not understand military working dogs. Today, however, every passing minute made the impossible seem a little more believable. Grace folded her patient notes and slipped them carefully into a leather portfolio resting beside her chair. As she reached for it, a faded hospital identification card slid partly from an inside pocket. Nathan noticed an old photograph attached to the badge. Grace looked much younger, standing beside another nurse wearing military medical fatigues. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood the entrance to a rehabilitation ward. Nathan felt another distant memory stir. Years after leaving active operations, he and Valor had occasionally visited military hospitals where recovering service members met retired working dogs during rehabilitation programs. They had walked long hallways lined with wheelchairs, physical therapy rooms, and quiet gardens filled with patients rebuilding their lives one determined step at a time. He remembered countless faces, but only in fragments. Grace followed his gaze toward the old identification card. "That was taken during my first month back at work after rehabilitation," she explained. "One of the therapy coordinators insisted we take a picture because she said healing deserved to be remembered." Nathan nodded slowly. Valor stood for the first time in several minutes and walked gently toward the portfolio resting beside Grace's chair. Instead of nudging it open, he simply lowered his nose near the worn leather before looking quietly back at Nathan. There was no urgency in his eyes, only the same patient confidence that had guided Nathan through countless difficult decisions. Nathan understood the silent message. Immediately, whatever answer they were searching for was not finished revealing itself. Somewhere inside Grace's story, hidden among ordinary memories and overlooked moments, waited the reason why an old military dog had crossed an entire cafe just to sit beside someone he had supposedly never met. Grace carefully lifted the worn leather portfolio from the side of her wheelchair and placed it gently on the cafe table. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, catching tiny specks of dust that drifted quietly through the warm air while the steady rhythm of conversations slowly returned around them. Valor remained seated beside her, watching every movement with calm attention. Nathan had already stopped trying to understand the old German shepherd's unusual behavior through commands alone. Instead, he trusted the same quiet instinct that had carried them through years of difficult missions. Grace opened the portfolio and smiled with slight embarrassment. "It is mostly paperwork," she said. "Schedules, patient notes, and a few things I never found a reason to throw away." She slid several folders aside before a small cloth pouch appeared near the bottom. The fabric had faded with age, its drawstring softened by years of careful handling. "I almost forgot this was here," she whispered. Valor slowly stood and took one step closer. His ears lifted, but his body remained completely relaxed. Nathan recognized the subtle change immediately. The dog was interested, not anxious. Grace loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents gently into her hand. A polished challenge coin rolled onto the table, followed by a neatly folded thank you card and a small military medical pin. Nathan's eyes settled on the coin. One side displayed the crest of a military medical center. The other carried the image of a German shepherd beneath the words, "Compassion is also service." He reached toward it carefully, turning it over in his hand. "I remember these," he said quietly. "They were given to volunteers and caregivers during one of the rehabilitation programs after several returning service members completed treatment." Grace looked surprised. "A senior nurse gave it to me years ago. She told me to keep it because every person who helps someone heal becomes part of their story." Nathan nodded slowly. She was right. Valor gently lowered his nose toward the coin, inhaled softly, and then rested his head against Grace's knee once more. The movement seemed almost ceremonial, as though the little piece of metal confirmed something he had sensed from the beginning. Across the cafe, an older volunteer wearing a red hospital jacket noticed the scene and approached with an easy smile. "That challenge coin brings back memories," he said. "I helped organize those rehabilitation events." He looked closely at Grace before recognition slowly appeared across his face. "You volunteered there after your own recovery, did you not?" Grace smiled warmly. "I did. I wanted other patients to know life could still be meaningful." The volunteer nodded before turning to Nathan and Valor. "We occasionally invited retired military working dogs to visit the wards. They always knew which patients needed company most." Nathan looked down at Valor. He always had a gift for that. The volunteer chuckled softly. Maybe it was not a gift. Maybe it was simply kindness doing what kindness does. His words lingered in the quiet space between them. Nathan glanced once more at the challenge coin, then at the peaceful dog resting beside Grace. Whether through memory, scent, or something impossible to measure, Valor had recognized a connection that every human in the room had overlooked. As the morning sunlight brightened the cafe and another day unfolded inside the hospital, Nathan realized they were no longer searching for proof that the past had linked them together. They were beginning to understand why that forgotten connection still mattered today. The elderly volunteer remained beside the table for another quiet moment before his eyes settled on the challenge coin resting near Grace's hand. He smiled gently, the kind of smile shaped by years of watching people heal in ways no medical chart could ever measure. "There is someone you should meet," he said. "She retired several years ago, but she still visits the hospital every Thursday morning." Grace looked curious. "Who?" The volunteer folded his hands together. "Margaret Collins. She supervised the rehabilitation therapy program when you first came here after your accident. She also coordinated every military working dog visit that came through this hospital." Nathan exchanged a thoughtful glance with Valor. The old German shepherd slowly lifted his head, his ears turning toward the volunteer's voice as though another familiar thread had quietly appeared. "Would she remember us?" Nathan asked. The volunteer laughed softly. "She remembers every patient and every dog who walked these halls. Some people collected photographs. Margaret collected stories." Grace smiled warmly. "I would like to thank her someday." "You may not have to wait very long," the volunteer replied. "She usually stops by the hospital cafe after finishing her morning rounds with the therapy volunteers." As though the timing itself had quietly answered him, the entrance door opened. A woman in her early 70s stepped inside, carrying a canvas tote filled with books and greeting cards. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her navy cardigan carried the small embroidered emblem of the hospital volunteer program. She moved with unhurried confidence, smiling at nurses and patients as she crossed the cafe. The elderly volunteer raised one hand. "Margaret." She looked over, smiled immediately, and approached the table. Before anyone could introduce her, Valor slowly stood. His tail moved in one slow sweep across the polished floor. Margaret stopped walking, her expression changing from pleasant curiosity to quiet surprise. "Well," she whispered, "I would recognize those eyes anywhere." She knelt carefully despite her age and gently placed both hands around Valor's face. The old German shepherd leaned into her touch without hesitation. Nathan watched in astonishment. Valor accepted affection from familiar people, but this greeting carried something deeper. It looked like two old friends meeting after many silent years. Margaret smiled through glistening eyes. "You have grown old with such dignity." Nathan stepped closer. "You know him?" She looked up. "Know him? I spent 6 weeks helping care for him after one of his early deployments. He visited our rehabilitation unit every Friday once he recovered." Grace's eyes widened. "He came here before?" Margaret nodded. Many times. She turned toward Grace with a thoughtful expression. And you were one of the first patients who refused to let him leave your room until you finished physical therapy. Grace blinked in surprise. I do not remember that. Margaret smiled gently. Trauma sometimes hides memories until the heart feels safe enough to let them return. She reached into her canvas bag and carefully removed a small photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. It showed a younger Grace sitting in a rehabilitation garden wrapped in a light blanket, smiling as Valor rested quietly beside her wheelchair. Nathan stood just behind them, holding the leash with a proud smile he barely remembered wearing. Morning sunlight filled the little garden in the photograph exactly as it filled the cafe now. Grace stared at the image in silence. Her fingertips trembled slightly as she traced the outline of the old German shepherd lying faithfully beside her younger self. Valor gently rested his head against her arm once more. This time no one questioned why. The answer had begun revealing itself one memory at a time, carried patiently through the years by a faithful dog who had never forgotten the people whose lives had become part of his own. Morning settled peacefully over the hospital campus, and the quiet excitement from the cafe slowly gave way to the familiar rhythm of nurses beginning their rounds. Sunlight filtered through long corridors lined with framed photographs honoring veterans, while the scent of fresh coffee gradually faded beneath the clean fragrance of polished floors and antiseptic. Margaret carefully held the old photograph between her hands as she invited Nathan and Grace to walk with her toward the rehabilitation garden where so many patients had once taken their first hopeful steps after difficult seasons of life. Valor followed at his usual steady pace, his nails clicking softly across the tile before the hallway opened into a courtyard filled with flowering roses, shade trees, and wooden benches. Warmed by the California sun, Grace stopped the moment she entered the garden. Something about the place stirred an emotion she could not immediately explain. She looked around slowly, her eyes lingering on a small stone fountain where sparrows gathered to drink. This feels familiar, she whispered. Margaret smiled gently. You spent many afternoons here. Nathan stayed quiet, letting the memories return at their own pace instead of forcing them into words. He had learned through years beside Valor that healing often arrived patiently, never hurried. Margaret guided them toward an old bench beneath a blooming dogwood tree. This is where you first met him, she said, looking at Grace before nodding toward Valor. You had finished a difficult therapy session that morning and did not want to speak to anyone. The therapist asked whether one of the visiting military dogs could sit with you. Grace looked down at the old German shepherd resting peacefully beside her wheelchair. And he chose me? Margaret shook her head softly. Actually, you reached for him first. You reached out before anyone suggested it. Valor simply laid down beside you and stayed there until you smiled for the first time in weeks. Nathan listened in thoughtful silence. He remembered bringing Valor to rehabilitation visits after active deployments because the German shepherd had an extraordinary calm around recovering service members. Yet he had never known the quiet difference those visits continued making after he left each afternoon. Margaret reached into her canvas bag once more and carefully unfolded a thin visitor log preserved inside a clear protective sleeve. Each page recorded the dates retired military working dogs visited the hospital. Near the center of one page, Grace found her own signature written in careful handwriting beside a simple note. Thank you for bringing Valor today. He reminded me that healing does not have to happen alone. Grace gently covered her mouth as tears gathered in her eyes. I wrote this. Margaret nodded. You insisted on writing something every Friday because you believed he understood kindness better than words. Nathan looked toward Valor, who had quietly rested his head beside Grace's hand once again. The old German shepherd seemed perfectly content beneath the morning sunshine, unaware that the people around him were rediscovering forgotten chapters of their own lives because he had carried them all this time. A gentle breeze carried flower petals across the courtyard as patients smiled while passing through the garden on their morning walks. Several paused to greet Valor, who welcomed every gentle touch with calm patience before returning his attention to Grace. Nathan realized that nothing about the dog's behavior that morning had been accidental. Valor had not interrupted a quiet breakfast. He had simply recognized someone who had once helped him bring hope into a place where hope was desperately needed. Standing there beneath the flowering trees, Nathan understood that some friendships are never measured by how often people meet. They are measured by the comfort they give when another soul needs it most. And even after years of silence, the old German shepherd had quietly remembered exactly where that comfort had once begun. The garden remained peaceful long after the morning therapy sessions ended. Sunlight filtered through the flowering dogwood branches, casting gentle patterns across the winding brick pathways, while the quiet splash of the stone fountain echoed through the warm California air. Patients moved slowly between benches with therapists nearby, each small step carrying its own quiet victory. Grace rested comfortably beneath the shade, her wheelchair turned toward the roses blooming along the edge of the courtyard. Valor lay beside her as though he had belonged there all along. Nathan stood a short distance away, watching the old German shepherd with the same thoughtful expression that had stayed with him since breakfast. Margaret quietly excused herself to greet another volunteer, leaving the three of them surrounded by little more than birdsong and the distant hum of hospital life. Grace smiled as she gently ran her fingers through Valor's thick sable fur. "He always knows how to make a place feel calmer," she said. Nathan nodded. That was one of the first things our trainers noticed. About him, some dogs searched, some protected. Valor had an unusual way of helping people breathe again. Grace looked toward the fountain, her eyes reflecting memories she could finally begin to recognize. "When I first arrived here after my accident, I felt like everything I had planned for my life had disappeared." She paused before continuing. "The nurses were wonderful. The therapists never gave up. But there were days when I stopped believing I could become useful again." Nathan listened without interrupting. He understood that silence often invited truth more gently than questions ever could. Grace smiled faintly. Then someone wheeled a German shepherd into the garden. He did not perform tricks. He did not demand attention. He simply sat beside me until I stopped crying. Nathan looked down at Valor. The old dog rested peacefully with his eyes half closed, completely unaware that the simple kindness he had offered years ago was still changing lives. "I wish I had known," Nathan admitted quietly. "Those hospital visits happened between deployments. We never stayed long enough to learn what happened afterward." Grace looked up at him. "You still came." The words were simple, yet they carried unexpected weight. "Sometimes people think healing only happens during the biggest moments," she continued. "For me, it started because someone believed a retired military dog could sit beside a stranger for a little while." A gentle breeze carried the fragrance of lavender through the garden as another group of patients entered the courtyard. Among them was a young Marine recovering from surgery. He walked carefully with the assistance of a physical therapist, his confidence still fragile. When he noticed Valor resting beneath the tree, he stopped and smiled. The therapist quietly asked Nathan whether the Marine could greet the dog. Nathan glanced toward Grace before smiling. "If Valor agrees." The Marine approached slowly, kneeling with visible effort before gently scratching beneath Valor's chin. The old German shepherd lifted his head, wagged his tail once, and leaned softly into the young man's hand. Relief spread across the Marine's face almost instantly. Grace watched the moment unfold with quiet understanding. "He is doing it again," she whispered. Nathan smiled. He never really stopped. Margaret returned carrying a small scrapbook from the volunteer office. Inside were photographs from years of therapy visits, community gatherings, and hospital celebrations. She carefully opened one page and pointed toward a faded photograph taken beneath the very same dogwood tree. It showed Grace smiling in her wheelchair with Valor resting faithfully at her side, while a younger Nathan stood behind them, completely unaware that an ordinary afternoon would become a memory carried by all three of them for years to come. Nathan looked at the photograph, then at the peaceful garden surrounding them. He finally understood that the most important missions of Valor's life had never appeared in military reports or official records. They had quietly continued in places exactly like this, where hope returned not through dramatic moments, but through the faithful presence of a dog who never forgot how to stay beside someone until they believed in tomorrow again. The weeks passed almost unnoticed, yet something gentle had changed inside the rehabilitation garden. Patients who once hurried through physical therapy now found reasons to linger beneath the flowering trees. Nurses paused during busy shifts to spend a few quiet moments outside. Veterans who rarely spoke began sharing stories while watching the old German shepherd rest peacefully beside whichever visitor needed comfort most. Valor never seemed to choose people at random. He simply walked slowly through the garden until he found someone sitting alone, then settled beside them without asking for anything in return. Nathan often wondered if that quiet gift had always been there, or if he had only learned to notice it after meeting Grace again. On one bright Thursday morning, Grace wheeled herself into the courtyard carrying a small canvas bag filled with children's books and watercolor pencils. Several young patients recovering from long hospital stays gathered around her beneath the dogwood tree. Their laughter floated gently across the garden while sunlight shimmered through the leaves overhead. Valor lay nearby, his silvered muzzle resting on his front paws, listening to every familiar voice with calm contentment. A little boy wearing a baseball cap carefully approached the old German shepherd. His movements were slow, uncertain, as though confidence had not fully returned after weeks in the hospital. He looked toward Grace before quietly asking, "Does he mind if I sit next to him?" Grace smiled warmly. He has always believed there is room for one more friend. The child lowered himself onto the grass beside Valor. The old dog lifted his head, looked at the boy for a moment, then gently leaned against his shoulder. The child's nervous expression slowly softened into a smile that reached his eyes. Nathan watched from a nearby bench, feeling the same quiet gratitude that had filled him since the morning everything changed inside the hospital cafe. Margaret joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You see it now, do not you?" she asked. Nathan accepted the cup and nodded. "For years I believed Valor's greatest work happened during missions." He looked toward the garden where children laughed around the old German shepherd. "I was wrong." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Some of the most important missions never make it into official records." She pointed toward the children. "Those are the ones people carry in their hearts." Grace finished reading a story before closing the book and looking across the garden. Her eyes met Nathan's, and for a quiet moment neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Both understood that the unexpected meeting beneath the hospital windows had reopened a forgotten chapter of their lives, not to relive old memories, but to create new ones. Later that afternoon, the hospital director invited Nathan into her office. Resting on the polished desk was a proposal for a permanent therapy program built around retired military working dogs visiting veterans, patients, and families. "We have seen what one faithful dog has done in only a few weeks," she said. "Would you consider helping us build something that lasts?" Nathan looked through the pages slowly before glancing toward the garden outside. Grace sat surrounded by children while Valor rested peacefully among them, accepting every gentle hand with patient dignity. Nathan smiled quietly. "I think my partner already accepted the job." The director laughed softly. "Then perhaps we should simply follow his lead." As the afternoon sun drifted lower across the hospital grounds, Nathan stepped back into the courtyard. Valor slowly walked toward him before turning once more to lie beside Grace's wheelchair. Nathan did not call him back. He simply stood beneath the warm California sky, realizing that some acts of service continue long after uniforms are folded away. They continue wherever compassion finds someone waiting to be reminded that they are never truly alone. Autumn arrived quietly at St. Matthew Veterans Medical Center, bringing cooler mornings and golden leaves that drifted gently across the rehabilitation garden. What had begun as an unexpected meeting in the hospital cafe had slowly become part of the rhythm of the entire campus. Every Thursday, patients gathered beneath the dogwood trees long before the scheduled therapy sessions began, not because they expected miracles, but because they knew Valor would be there. The old German shepherd no longer moved with the effortless speed that had once carried him beside Navy SEAL teams, yet every careful step seemed filled with the same quiet purpose. Nathan watched from the edge of the courtyard while Grace greeted new patients arriving for the morning program. She knew nearly every name now. Some visitors were recovering from surgeries. Others were veterans learning to adjust to permanent injuries. A few were family members carrying invisible burdens that no medical scan could reveal. Grace welcomed each of them with the same warm smile she had once struggled to believe she would ever wear again. Valor wandered slowly among the benches until he paused beside an elderly veteran sitting alone beneath a maple tree. The man stared silently toward the fountain, his hands resting on a folded military cap. Without making a sound, Valor lowered himself beside the bench and rested gently against the man's leg. The veteran looked down in surprise before slowly placing one weathered hand on the dog's head. Nathan noticed the man's shoulders relax almost immediately. He had seen that transformation before. It was never dramatic. It was always quiet, like sunrise replacing darkness without asking permission. Grace walked over carrying 2 cups of warm tea. She offered one to the veteran before sitting beside him. No one rushed the conversation. They simply shared the peaceful morning together, while Valor remained exactly where he was needed. Across the courtyard, Margaret watched with quiet satisfaction. "Do you see it?" she asked Nathan softly. "People think they come here to meet a remarkable dog. They leave remembering that someone noticed them." Nathan smiled as he looked toward his old partner. That has always been his greatest gift. Later that afternoon, the hospital director unveiled a simple wooden sign near the entrance to the garden. It read, "The Valor Companion Garden, where healing begins with kindness." There were no grand speeches, no television cameras, only patients, nurses, volunteers, veterans, and families standing together beneath the autumn sky. Grace reached for Nathan's hand as they admired the sign. "He changed this place," she whispered. Nathan gently shook his head. "He reminded us what this place was always meant to be." As if sensing his name, Valor slowly walked toward them. Around his collar rested the small military tags he had worn for years, now joined by the modest medical challenge coin Grace had carefully attached weeks earlier. The metal caught the afternoon sunlight, shining softly without demanding attention. A young nurse approached with a little girl visiting her grandfather. The child hesitated before asking, "May I pet him?" Nathan nodded. "You may." Valor looked up, wagged his tail once, and welcomed the small hand resting gently against his silvered muzzle. The little girl smiled with the pure relief only children can show. Grace watched the moment unfold with quiet gratitude. Years earlier, she had been the frightened patient searching for hope. Now she had become someone who helped others find it. Nathan realized that the mystery which began in a crowded café had never truly been about why. Valor stopped beside one nurse. The real answer was far greater. The old German shepherd had recognized a heart that had once chosen compassion even while carrying its own pain, and by bringing that forgotten connection back into the light, he had quietly given countless other people permission to believe that healing, too, could find them. Late November brought crisp mornings and brilliant blue skies to the hospital campus, and the companion garden had become one of the quietest places in the entire medical center. Veterans paused there before appointments. Nurses stopped by between demanding shifts. Families sat beneath the trees when words felt too difficult to find. None of them came searching for extraordinary moments. They simply came because peace seemed easier to discover wherever Valor rested. The old German shepherd greeted each familiar face with the same patient warmth that had become the heart of the garden. Nathan often arrived before sunrise, carrying 2 cups of coffee and watching the first lights spread across the walking paths. Grace usually joined him after completing her earliest rounds, rolling her wheelchair beneath the dogwood tree where Valor always waited without needing to be called. One quiet morning, Margaret approached carrying a slim leather binder tied with a faded blue ribbon. She placed it carefully on the bench between them. "I think this belongs with the people who helped create its final chapter," she said. Nathan opened the binder slowly. Inside were handwritten notes, photographs, visitor logs, and letters collected throughout years of military therapy visits. Each page told a small story of recovery. A Marine learning to walk again. A widow smiling for the first time in months. A frightened child laughing while brushing the coat of a patient German shepherd. Near the center of the binder rested a letter written by a rehabilitation physician who had retired many years earlier. Nathan quietly read the final paragraph aloud. "Healing often begins before medicine can measure it. Sometimes it starts the moment another living soul chooses to stay beside someone who believes they have been forgotten." Grace lowered her eyes toward Valor. The old dog rested comfortably against the wheel of her chair, breathing slowly beneath the warm autumn sunlight. She smiled through quiet emotion. "That sentence describes him better than any military record ever could." Margaret nodded. Many people thanked the doctors. Many thanked the nurses. Some remembered the therapists. But nearly everyone wrote at least one sentence about the military dog who never seemed to know when his work was finished. Nathan carefully turned another page. Tucked inside a protective sleeve was a small photograph he had never seen before. It showed Grace during one of her earliest rehabilitation sessions, seated beneath the very same dogwood tree while Valor rested across her feet. Nathan stood several yards away speaking with hospital staff, completely unaware that a volunteer had quietly captured the moment. On the back of the photograph someone had written, "Some patients heal because they are treated. Others heal because they are accompanied." Nathan remained silent for a long time. During years of military service, he had learned to measure success through completed objectives, careful planning, and disciplined teamwork. Yet no training manual had ever prepared him to understand how much comfort one faithful dog could offer simply by refusing to walk away from someone who needed company. Grace reached for the photograph and gently traced its worn edges. "I do not remember every therapy session," she admitted, "but I remember never feeling alone whenever he visited." Valor slowly opened his eyes and looked from Grace to Nathan before quietly resting his head against the bench between them, connecting them with the same peaceful presence that had first astonished an entire café. Around them, the companion garden continued welcoming new visitors throughout the day. Some came carrying visible scars. Others carried burdens no one else could see. Every person who entered found the same simple invitation waiting beneath the trees. A place to rest. A place to breathe. A place where one aging German shepherd continued proving that the most lasting acts of service are often the quietest, leaving hope behind long after the footsteps that delivered it have disappeared. Winter settled gently over the hospital grounds, covering the companion garden with a quiet stillness that seemed to invite reflection more than silence. The flowering dogwood had surrendered its blossoms months before, leaving delicate branches outlined against a pale blue sky, while the morning air carried the crisp scent of pine and distant rain. Inside the rehabilitation center, however, warmth filled every hallway. Laughter drifted from therapy rooms. Volunteers greeted patients by name. Nurses hurried from room to room with the steady confidence that comes only from caring deeply for people they may never fully know. Grace had become one of those familiar faces everyone looked for each morning. She moved through the corridors in her wheelchair with practiced ease, always carrying an encouraging word, a gentle smile, or simply the willingness to pause beside someone having a difficult day. Nathan noticed how naturally people relaxed when she entered a room. They trusted her because she understood that healing often arrived one quiet conversation at a time. Valor understood it too. The old German shepherd no longer visited every room as he once had. Age had slowed his body, but it had sharpened something even more important. He seemed to know exactly where his presence was needed. On that particular morning, he wandered calmly through the companion garden before stopping beside a young Navy corpsman sitting alone beneath the covered walkway. The young man stared silently at the ground, turning an unopened letter over in his hands. Without hesitation, Valor lowered himself beside the bench and rested gently against the man's leg. The corpsman looked down in surprise before absent-mindedly scratching behind the dog's ears. Several minutes passed before he finally unfolded the letter and began reading. Nathan watched from across the courtyard. He did not interrupt. He simply smiled to himself. Grace rolled quietly beside him. "He found another one," she whispered. Nathan nodded. "He always does." Margaret joined them carrying a small wooden frame wrapped carefully in tissue paper. "The hospital board asked me to give you this today," she said. Grace accepted the package with quiet curiosity. Inside rested the photograph from years earlier, showing a younger Grace sitting beneath the dogwood tree while Valor lay peacefully beside her during rehabilitation. Beneath the picture, a brass plaque had been engraved with a simple inscription: "Hope often arrives before memory returns." Grace looked toward Nathan, emotion softening her smile. "I never imagined one ordinary therapy visit would become something people remembered." Nathan gently shook his head. It was never ordinary. He glanced toward Valor, who remained quietly beside the young corpsman. None of the moments that truly change our lives ever feel extraordinary while they are happening. Later that afternoon, the hospital hosted a small gathering to celebrate the first anniversary of the companion garden program. There were no elaborate decorations, only fresh flowers, warm coffee, homemade cookies, and people whose lives had quietly intersected because one faithful dog refused to walk past those who needed comfort. Veterans shared stories. Nurses laughed with former patients who had returned simply to say thank you. Families introduced children who had once feared hospitals, but now ran happily through the gardens searching for Valor. As the gathering drew to a close, the hospital director stood beside the entrance and looked across the courtyard. "Programs like this cannot be measured by numbers alone," she said softly. "They are measured by people who leave believing tomorrow might be a little brighter than yesterday." Nathan looked toward Grace. She reached down and gently rested her hand against Valor's silvered muzzle. The old German shepherd closed his eyes for a peaceful moment, completely content beneath the winter sunlight. Watching them together, Nathan finally understood that Valor had never interrupted a breakfast, stopped a café, or surprised an entire room for attention. He had simply recognized the person who once helped him bring hope into a place filled with uncertainty, and by finding her again, he quietly reminded everyone around them that kindness is never truly forgotten. Spring returned to the hospital with quiet confidence, painting the companion garden in fresh shades of green, while new blossoms opened beneath the same dogwood tree that had witnessed so many small moments of healing. The garden no longer belonged only to patients recovering from surgery or veterans learning to trust tomorrow again. Families visited after appointments simply to sit together beneath the trees. Volunteers brought books for children. Therapists scheduled outdoor sessions whenever the weather allowed. Somehow, the peaceful corner of the medical center had become a place where people remembered to breathe a little more deeply. Nathan often arrived before sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee while Valor walked beside him at an easy pace. The old German shepherd had grown slower over the passing months, his silvered muzzle and careful steps revealing the years he had faithfully carried. Yet his eyes still searched every face with quiet kindness. Grace usually met them in the garden before beginning her nursing shift. Together, they welcomed each new morning without needing many words. One Friday, the hospital hosted its first gathering dedicated entirely to retired military working dogs and the families whose lives they had touched. Modest folding chairs lined the garden paths. Veterans shared memories with children who listened wide-eyed. Nurses placed handmade blue ribbons around the necks of every visiting dog as a simple symbol of gratitude rather than recognition. No speeches celebrated extraordinary achievements. Instead, people spoke about ordinary moments that had quietly changed everything. A father described how one patient dog had helped his young son smile during months of difficult treatments. A retired Marine explained that sitting beside a calm German shepherd had been the first time he had slept peacefully in years. Grace listened from beneath the dogwood tree, her hands resting gently on Valor's shoulders. She realized that every story carried the same invisible thread. Healing had begun not because someone offered perfect answers, but because someone stayed long enough to remind another person they were not alone. Later that afternoon, Nathan found an old wooden memory box waiting on one of the garden benches. Inside were handwritten notes from patients, families, therapists, and volunteers who had spent time with Valor over the years. Some messages were only a few lines long. Others filled several pages. One note from a child simply read, "Thank you for sitting with me when I was scared." Another from an elderly veteran said, "You never asked what happened to me. You simply stayed." Nathan quietly handed the box to Grace. "I think this belongs to both of you now." Grace carefully added one final note before closing the lid. She wrote, "The first time I believed my life still had purpose after my accident, an old military dog chose to sit beside me. Years later, he found me again and reminded me that hope remembers the people who once welcomed it." She smiled as she placed the note inside. Valor rested peacefully at her feet, unaware that his quiet choices had become treasured memories carried by dozens of people whose paths had crossed his own. As the sun lowered beyond the hospital buildings, casting long golden light across the garden, Nathan looked around at the families talking together, the children laughing near the fountain, the veterans sharing coffee beneath the trees, and the faithful German shepherd resting calmly in the center of it all. He finally understood that some legacies are not built through monuments or medals. They grow quietly through lives made gentler because one loyal heart chose compassion again and again. The companion garden had become living proof that kindness can continue its work long after a mission ends, and every new morning carried another opportunity for that gentle work to begin again. 1 year later, the companion garden no longer felt like a quiet corner hidden inside a hospital. It had become a place people searched for whenever life grew heavier than words could carry. The dogwood tree stood taller than before, its branches stretching across the stone pathway, where morning sunlight painted soft patterns that shifted with every passing breeze. Flowers bloomed beside carefully tended walking paths, and the gentle sound of the fountain welcomed every visitor long before they reached the benches beneath the trees. Nathan arrived just after sunrise, carrying 2 cups of coffee the way he always did. His steps had become slower, not because of age alone, but because he had learned that peaceful places deserved unhurried footsteps. Beside him walked Valor. The old German shepherd's muzzle had turned almost completely silver now, and every movement reflected the quiet dignity of a life faithfully lived. Yet when children spotted him from across the garden, his tail still answered before the rest of him did. Grace waited beneath the same dogwood tree where so many forgotten memories had quietly found their way home. Her wheelchair rested beside the garden bench, surrounded by children drawing pictures with colored pencils, while several veterans shared stories nearby. She smiled as Valor approached, and just as he had done on the very first morning inside the hospital cafe, he gently lowered himself beside her chair and rested his head against her hand. Nothing about the gesture had changed. It no longer surprised anyone. It had simply become part of the garden, like the fountain, the flowers, and the morning birdsong. Nathan sat quietly beside them, watching the scene unfold with grateful eyes. Years earlier, he believed the greatest chapters of his life had ended the day he folded away his uniform. He had been wrong. The most meaningful chapter had begun the morning his faithful partner ignored a familiar command and followed a memory only he could still recognize. Grace looked across the garden where a young veteran smiled while reading a picture book to his daughter. "Do you ever wonder why Valor remembered me after all those years?" she asked softly. Nathan smiled without taking his eyes off the old dog. "I stopped asking that question a long time ago." He reached down and gently scratched behind Valor's ears. "Some hearts remember through photographs. Some remember through stories. Dogs remember through love." Grace rested both hands gently on Valor's shoulders. "Then maybe love never really forgets anyone." A light breeze carried flower petals across the path as church bells from a nearby chapel echoed faintly beyond the hospital grounds. Volunteers began preparing for another day of welcoming patients into the companion garden. Nurses waved as they passed. Veterans tipped their hats. Children hurried over simply to say good morning to the old German shepherd who had become the quiet soul of the place. No one there talked about medals. No one spoke about extraordinary missions. They remembered something far simpler. An aging military dog who chose to sit beside one person when everyone else expected something different, and by doing so reminded an entire community that compassion often begins with the smallest decision. As the sun climbed higher above the California sky, Nathan looked toward Grace and then toward Valor resting peacefully between them. 3 lives had crossed paths once during hardship, drifted apart through time, and found each other again because one faithful companion refused to forget. Perhaps that is how the most meaningful stories end. Not with applause, not with perfect answers, but with quiet hearts discovering that hope was never truly lost. It had simply been waiting patiently to be recognized. If this story stayed with you after the final words, we would truly love to know which moment touched your heart the most. Your thoughts help us create stories that celebrate kindness, courage, and loyalty. And if you enjoy heartfelt journeys like this one, consider subscribing so you can join us for more stories that remind us how even the quietest act of compassion can leave a lasting light in someone else's life.